In 1937, 40-year-old Godfather Vito Genovese arrived in fascist Italy from America. He was fleeing the New York Police Department, who wanted him on a murder charge. Genovese realized immediately that the Mussolini regime held great opportunities for new business. From America, he ordered shipments of cocaine, a fashionable drug among the Italian intellectual elite. He worked his way into the social circles of Count Galeazzo Ciano, who was married to Edda, Mussolini's favorite daughter. He even financed the building of a fascist party office. When cocaine and money weren't enough to gain acceptance in the regime, he tried other crime. Carlo Tresca, an anti-fascist publisher and enemy of Mussolini, was living in New York. On Vito Genovese's order, Tresca was murdered on Fifth Avenue. In his late 30s, Bugsy Siegel was as handsome as a Hollywood actor. He was also well known as a gunslinger. Passionately dedicated to women, in 1939 he traveled to Italy with one of his mistresses, Countess Dorothy di Frasso. Her plan was to assassinate Mussolini with a bomb. The Countess, in fact, never even tried. Bugsy, however, was now inside what the Nazis called Fortress Europe, a continent under their domination. Bugsy was a gangster and a Jew. Under the Nazis, someone like him was unlikely to make it to the gates of the concentration camp alive. Horrified by anti-Semitism, he left the Countess and returned to America. Meanwhile, the Godfather's Commission reprimanded Vito Genovese. They had not liked his pro-Mussolini initiatives. The Mafia was against fascism and Nazism. To properly manage its business, it needed democracy, with its freedom and constituted rights. In December 1941, the United States entered the Second World War. It soon discovered that its docks weren't secure, that strikes were still taking place in the factories, and that enemy submarines could move right up to the shorelines where the supplies were. A series of attacks spread the idea that Italian, German, and Japanese spies had infiltrated the United States. Some saboteurs were captured, tried, and executed. Once more, as in the previous World War, Luciano's Cosa Nostra demonstrated its dexterity at finding new opportunities to increase its power. New York's Navy shipyards were at work on the Normandy. It was the fastest transatlantic ship in the world, able to elude the German U-boats while carrying American troops to Europe. On the 11th of February 1942, the city awoke to a cloud of smoke above the overturned ship. The plan had been conceived by one of Luciano's men, Albert Anastasia. The Mafia wanted to demonstrate that the docks of New York were Cosa Nostra, our thing. The war did not allow any more time. The military had to work with Cosa Nostra. The U.S. Chief of Staff Admiral Haffenden and District Attorney Dewey approved the top-secret Operation Underworld. the Navy's Secret Service made contact with the Mafia. Soon afterwards, the docks became safer, the sabotaging stopped, and so did the strikes in the factories. The Allied countries against Nazi fascism could now count on yet another ally, Cosa Nostra. The government within the government, the underworld, had entered the Second World War. Cooperation with the Mafia extended to the Allied forces landing in Sicily on the 9th of July 1943 in a huge naval operation. It is said that a lone American tank arrived in the village of Villalba. A soldier called out to Don Vizzini on a bullhorn. When he approached the tank, the soldier waved the symbol of the collaboration with the Mafia, a handkerchief with an L, as in Lucky Luciano. But there's no need for hearsay. In the heart of the war zone, a combat cameraman filmed a fisherman's boat transporting a man of honor on his way to boarding a military ship. In 1943, an Allied military government was formed in Italy, headed by Attorney-at-Law Charles Poletti. A year before, Poletti had been the temporary governor of New York, right after the fire on the Normandy, at the peak of Operation Underworld. He held this post for just a few weeks, enough time for him to pardon a few Mafia men. Vito Genovese managed to get hired as a translator in military governor Poletti's office. He was fired only when his file landed on the desk of the chief of staff. Before the Allies, several godfathers claimed to be anti-fascists. They said they had been persecuted by Mori, the prefect of iron, sent to Sicily by Mussolini. A few of them were even appointed mayors, among them Calogero Vizzini, the godfather of Villalba. After the Second World War, a separatist movement was born in Sicily in favor of annexing the Italian island to the United States of America. One of the leaders of this movement was Godfather Don Calogero Vizzini. In Rome, it was time for elections to form the first democratic government after 20 years of dictatorship. The Communist Party, many of whose members had played a major role in the war of resistance against Nazi fascism, wanted seats in the new Italian cabinet. They would never allow Sicily to become part of the United States. The Americans prepared a top-secret plan to reoccupy Sicily if the Communists won. As usual, injustices were frequent on the island. But the rationing of flour brought one injustice too many, and a young man reacted by opening fire. Salvatore Giuliano became a gang leader, one of the top fighters in the separatist movement, which made him commander of the Revolutionary Army. But annexing Sicily to America meant stopping the communists first. On the 1st of May 1947, Labor Day, Salvatore Giuliano's men took aim at the workers demonstrating in Portella delle Ginestre near Palermo. It was a massacre. On the 18th of April 1948, after a dramatic electoral campaign, Election Day arrived. The communists lost. But Salvatore Giuliano knew he was in trouble. With the new democratic order in place in Rome, Sicily would never become part of the United States. He knew he had become useless. His gang drew the attention of the police, disturbing the underworld's business. The Godfathers issued the death sentence. Giuliano was killed on the 5th of May 1950.
The bandit becomes a myth after many years, when the murders he has committed are forgotten.
Salvatore Giuliano was a bandit responsible for the murder of many innocent people. Yet he had posed as a guerrilla fighter.
It's a fact that the criminal in disguise helps to reduce the criminal profile of the mafia itself. The bandit Giuliano, as he is still called, was a criminal.
As a guerrilla fighter, Salvatore Giuliano had fallen in love. A son was born to him, named after his father, Salvatore Giuliano. When trouble came, Giuliano had his son taken out of Sicily through the Mafia's secret network. When that boy became a man, not uncharacteristically, he denied the very existence of the Mafia.
It's the Italian government that says they're godfathers. We'll have to see. The word godfather means a mafioso. Since the mafia doesn't exist, godfathers cannot exist.
In the United States, the help and cooperation of the Mafia during the Second World War did not go unrewarded. Lucky Luciano's 30-year sentence vanished into thin air. He was released from prison in 1946. Someone even proposed that the US Congress award him a medal, as if he were a war hero.
This man was not a hero. He was a very bad man. He was a criminal. And criminals deserve to be off the streets. They shouldn't be roaming the streets of this city, or any city, for that matter.
The motion for the medal was soon forgotten. After all, Luciano was still a criminal. He was sent to Italy on the condition that he never returned to America again. Invisibly and silently, Lucky Luciano immediately set out to solidify relations with Don Calogero Vizzini of Villalba, the only Sicilian godfather he really trusted.
Lucky Luciano was of course a highly intelligent and efficient criminal who was a bridgehead in Italy and made business between the two organizations easier, creating more consistency between them.
In the 1950s, the economy of Italy began to change dramatically. It started to become a modern industrialized country. Inevitably, the Sicilian mafia that had remained bound to the private land estates began to die out. It was time to breed a new generation of mafiosi. Lucky Luciano and Don Vizzini would take care of that. In America, in the 50s, the Commission, the Mafia's board of directors, was helmed by 5 families: the Gambinos, the Genoveses, the Bonannos, the Colombos, and the Luccheses.
Well, I think the role that was typified in the Godfather movies never existed. That was a highly romantic view of what many people say was modeled after Carlo Gambino, but every mafia family in Sicily and the families in the United States are vicious criminals, vicious murderers. They are not romantic family individuals as were portrayed.
The title character in the movie The Godfather was actually inspired by a number of different real-life godfathers, all former pupils of Lucky Luciano's Mafia school. Carlo Gambino was the smartest of them all. His rise as a godfather began in 1946 when Luciano was deported to Italy. Luciano was his role model. From him, Gambino learned to keep a low profile. When somebody said he was a coward, he let them talk. He knew his true weapon was his intelligence. In 1947, after just a year in Italy, Lucky Luciano already felt Italy was too small for him. But he couldn't go back to the States, so he settled for the next best thing, Cuba. Another mafia heaven where the American godfathers had expanded their business with casinos and nightclubs. As in Atlantic City in 1929, Luciano called for another underworld conference, the Havana Conference. Like any ordinary tourist, Lucky Luciano left Italy and reached Cuba. There he met up with his old friend Meyer Lansky and other middle-aged godfathers. In Cuba, Luciano explained his plan to the other godfathers, what today would be called a global market for drugs.
The mafia has a kind of stock market. The major drug shipments had cartels, which were groups of family bosses that coordinated the purchase of a huge drug shipment, going on someone's word, and then it was split among the members of the cartel, who guaranteed the payment for what they had purchased.
At the Havana Conference, Luciano laid out his grand plan to expand this business. The drugs would be produced in the Far East, where the governments pretended not to see the enormous plantations. The refining process would then be entrusted to the Italians in Sicily. Cuba was to be the distribution point. To bring in the refined drugs, they could rely on the Italian emigrants still leaving Italy, connected to the mafia through their families in the United States.
They were undercover journeys, like the old lady who visits her relatives in the United States and smuggles in 1 or 2 kilos of heroin, or store owners who sneak in a small amount compared to the enormous quantity that was refined.
It was called the rain method. Many godfathers like Vito Genovese and Don Calogero Vizzini entered a new business, this time legal. Importing canned food, another perfect way to conceal the drugs.
Non si comprese ai tempi l'importanza di questa attività. Non si comprese subito che sotto questa attività.
At first, the whole thing was underestimated. No one thought that behind all this lay drug smuggling. No one thought that drug smuggling could directly involve Sicily.
Già allora potesse coinvolgere in modo diretto la Sicilia.
Ironically, the canned food business run by the godfathers was a success in its own right.
La Cosa Nostra ha avuto un approccio con la droga sin dagli anni.
Cosa Nostra began dealing in drugs back in the 50s, and it improved this business over 2 decades, almost 3, succeeding not only to become a part of the worldwide drug business, but also to manage it on its own, thanks to the Far East and Middle East production sources of morphine, the huge Western markets, and its own very safe and profitable distribution channels.
In Palermo in 1957, managing the global drug market had proved more difficult than Luciano and the other godfathers had anticipated 10 years before. In a changing world, it was time to call for another meeting.
In March
1957, at the Hotel La Palma in Palermo, a meeting was held of the highest historical criminal relevance, of course. It was the occasion to gather around a table, and for several days, the leading personalities of the American Cosa Nostra, from New York to Buffalo to Detroit and other areas of the States, with leading Cosa Nostra personalities from Palermo and other towns in Sicily.
For the underworld, it would be an historic conference. All the godfathers attended.
If we want to find a definition for the Palme meeting, we can sum it up as follows. The Italian mafia modeled itself on the Americans without abdicating its authority to the American cousins, and it opened very profitable channels for drug trafficking.
A few months after the Palermo conference, Vito Genovese, on his own initiative, called for another meeting, this time in America. The Appalachian Conference in upstate New York was held in late 1957.
So we believe that the main purpose was for the bosses of the American families to decide whether or not they would engage jointly in heroin trafficking with their cousins from Sicily.
In Italy, Luciano immediately understood that Vito Genovese's real purpose was to take control of the commission. To the meeting, he sent only the astute Carlo Gambino, ordering his men to stay away. Then he tipped off the New York Police Department.
There would be national meetings involving the families from all over the country. And of course, that's what was interrupted and discovered in Appalachian, New York in the late 1950s. They were having a national meeting of all of the families. That was rare. Those kinds of meetings took place infrequently because they were too dangerous.
The New York Police Department raided the meeting and arrested a few of the godfathers, including Carlo Gambino. He had been Lucky Luciano's sacrificial lamb. The FBI was caught off guard by Luciano's move. After years spent saying the Mafia didn't exist, FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover got to work. Cosa Nostra had lost its legendary invisibility. In Italy, in the mid-50s, a man would cross the path of the Seven Sisters, the major international oil companies. His name was Enrico Mattei. As the president of Agip, Italy's state-owned oil company, he would interfere with the huge business of black gold. He would have to be stopped, and the Mafia could be very useful. Enrico Mattei had been one of the great resistance commanders during the Second World War. He was one of those who had decided to send in a unit to arrest Mussolini. The unit had captured Mussolini before the Allies could. On the 29th of April 1945, he was shot and hung by the feet in Milan to be shown to the crowd. After the war, Mattei could have held any prestigious political position. Unexpectedly, he asked for a seemingly dead-end state-owned oil company named Agip. And then Mattei found oil everywhere. In just a few years, he quickly rose in the global market of black gold in which the entire planet's interests were at stake. He laid the foundations for Italy's economic boom of the 1960s. He reached agreements with the Russian communists and the Arab countries for the exploitation of their oil fields. Soon, Mattei became a problem for the major international oil companies. They realized their monopoly over black gold was in danger. On the 27th of October 1962, he boarded a private jet in Sicily. He took off from Catania at 4:57 p.m. Exactly 2 hours later, at 6:57 p.m., the plane crashed in Bescape, near Milan.
La mafia tenta di uccidere nella maniera più efficace possibile.
The mafia tries to kill in the most efficient way, without leaving any traces. The mafia says that a perfect murder is one that eliminated the body and eliminates the memory of it.
Elimina il corpo ed elimina la memoria.
The crash of the plane carrying Enrico Mattei was ruled an accident. In September 1994, however, the investigation was reopened. A mafia informer, Gaetano Ianni, testified that Mattei's plane had been sabotaged by the Sicilian mafia as a favor to their American cousins. There is still no official verdict on the case.
Uccide per eliminare un possibile nemico.
The mafia kills to get rid of a potential enemy, a potential adversary, someone who can harm the family, or it gives a warning to the others. Be aware of what you're doing. This is how you'll end up.
In Naples on the 26th of January 1962, Lucky Luciano was conducting business as usual when he collapsed on the floor of the Naples airport with a heart attack. He was about to negotiate the rights to his biography to make a book and a film. Back in New York City in 1962, Joe Valachi, a soldier in the family of Vito Genovese, was arrested for drugs offenses. When Valachi was taken in, his boss was not confident he would keep his mouth shut. 3 times he tried to have him killed in prison. Genovese was right. On the 13th of July 1962, Joe Valachi became the most famous mafia informer up to that time.
L'indifferenza che prima contraddistingueva forse la maggior parte.
The indifference that used to characterize most people's attitude toward the mafia had changed. There is much less of it. People realize the mafia is a criminal phenomenon, and that may lead to the end of the mafia.
Un fenomeno criminale.
The wall of silence that had surrounded the mafia for decades showed its first cracks. In Italy, however, one mafia informer's predicament was quite different. His name was Leonardo Vitali, a man of honor of the family of Altarello near Palermo. In 1973, he explained to the judges how the mafia was really a single powerful organization with branches throughout the world. The court thought him mad and locked him up in a psychiatric ward. The killers waited 10 years. On the 2nd of December 1984, when he finally left the asylum, Leonardo Vitali was killed. Everyone had to know that speaking against the mafia meant death. In Italy, princes, barons and counts had been a part of the mafia ever since its origins. Even Joseph Bonanno, one of the founding members of the American Underworld's Commission, was a nobleman. The bronze door in Pisa's Duomo is named after the Bonanno family, one of the oldest in town. However, he did not like to be called Don. He preferred to be called the Father.
I mean, he's one of those people about which you would say, if he had gone in another direction, he could have been very successful. Fortunately, he sought the direction of crime. But then he tried to, I think, insulate himself from facing what it was all about with these pretensions of, this is like a government, this is like, I'm like the head of state, which he's said, and I'm like a deposed head of state when he was finally retired.
By the mid-60s, Joseph Bonanno nurtured the plan to kill all the members of the commission and become the big mafia chief of New York City. In 1964, the commission got wind of his plan and kidnapped him. They advised him it was time for him to abdicate. Wisely enough, he agreed. Carlo Gambino didn't make the same choice as Bonanno. He remained in control of his family until his dying day. He had learned Lucky Luciano's lesson on invisibility perfectly, better than any other godfather. When he died in 1976, his role was taken over by Big Paul Castellano. He had a true temper. He was so contentious that even his soldiers hated him. He didn't have the right stuff to be a real godfather. He was killed in front of a New York City steakhouse in 1985.
There have been plenty of Italian-American heroes in law enforcement, but these are not well known. These were not the subjects of series. These were not the subjects of one blockbuster movie after another. These were not 4-hour spectaculars. These were not series like The Sopranos. What works in this country is blood dripping from a stiletto, rape, crushing a man's head with a golf club because your boss ordered you to do it, Italian-American thugs. Even the Italians go watch it.
In Sicily, in the mid-50s, Corleone, a small town 30 miles south of Palermo, had for decades been under the criminal domination of Don Michele Navarra, a physician godfather whose only interest was power. Until Luciano Liggio, one of his soldiers, began his own rise to power. When he felt the time was right, on the 2nd of August 1958, Liggio killed Don Navarra. He usurped the throne and formed the Corleone gang, who would become one of the most ruthless in the history of the Mafia. He expanded his activity to northern Italy. In 1973, he kidnapped Paul Getty III, the grandson of oil tycoon Paul Getty Sr., and cut off his earlobe to convince the family to pay the ransom. He was arrested in Milan in 1974 and sentenced to life. His position in Corleone was taken over by Toto Riina, known as Toto the Shorty because of his height, 5'2". He was short, but had ambitions. Without consulting anyone, in full violation of any rule of the Commission, the Corleone gang of Toto Riina started killing the other godfathers to make room for themselves in the drug market. No attack on government officials had been Lucky Luciano's order many years before, but by the mid-70s, his lesson had faded away. In Sicily, the Corleone gang killed policemen and carabinieri.
Some of the organized crime figures are among the most vicious, horrible, awful human beings you'd ever meet, almost animalistic in quality. And some of them, except for the criminal part of their life, they can be very nice people.
Corleone struggled to be known not only as the mafia capital of Italy.
It must be said that Corleone has taken some huge steps forward. Considering the impenetrable Omata that existed, it has changed a lot. There has been an awakening, an exceptional renaissance.
Michele Sindona was born in Patti, near Messina, in 1920. A mathematical and financial genius, he would reach dizzying heights laundering dirty money for the mafia, both in Italy and America. Until one day, he ran into an old-fashioned gentleman. His name was Giorgio Ambrosoli. He was an attorney at law, and his job was to pursue Michele Sindona, the banker godfather. The son of a mortician, Michele Sindona had proved to be a mathematical genius while still at school. Through laundering dirty money for the Mafia, both in Italy and the United States, he became the banker godfather. In Milan, on the 27th of September 1974, Giorgio Ambrosoli, a man of great moral integrity, was assigned by the court to liquidate one of the many firms controlled by the banker godfather, Michele Sindona. In his thorough investigation, Ambrosoli uncovered the secrets of the Sindona empire and his ties with the Mafia. In 1972, in the US, Sindona had bought the Franklin National Bank, and this acquisition was currently under investigation by the American judges. They asked Ambrosoli to testify in their case against Sindona. Shortly after his testimony, Giorgio Ambrosoli was killed in Milan. The Italian police traced the hitman back to Michele Sindona, who was arrested. Laundering dirty money from drug smuggling and other illegal activities required moving it around quickly. When Sindona ended up in jail, all the money he controlled stopped spinning. From outside, the Godfather sent Sindona a message. They wanted to know where their money was. Sindona knew he was lost and threatened to talk. In 1986, he was 65. At his age, he should have known better than to threaten the Godfathers. Sindona had a coffee in his cell. Drinking it was his last mistake. It was laced with cyanide. Stefano Bontate had changed his last name. It used to be Bonta, meaning goodness in Italian. He didn't love invisibility as a don. He intended to exercise his authority as a godfather by living in luxury and mixing with high society in Palermo. Bontate decided to stop the power of the Corleone gang. The bloodshed continued in the streets of Sicily. He sought new alliances in the Masonic lodges and the corrupted members of the Italian secret services. He moved to strengthen ties with the American cousins. But the members of the commission didn't approve of the war underway in Sicily. It was against the rules of the American Cosa Nostra to use bombs and to kill innocent people, as the Corleone families were doing.
They were told in very strong terms that if they came to the United States, conducted criminal operations in the United States, they were not allowed to use that type of terror within the United States. They were not to do it. They were not to attract attention of law enforcement and the American public by engaging in those type of activities here.
The American Cosa Nostra decided to separate themselves from the Sicilians, and the agreements taken at the Hotel Le Palme conference back in 1957 were essentially cancelled.
I don't believe there still are many structural relations or intensely strategic theories like those studied at the Hotel Le Palme conference in Palermo in 1957.
Stefano Bontate never made it to become the godfather of Corleone. He was killed in Palermo on the 23rd of April 1981. his murder triggered off yet another full-scale mafia war in Italy. This time, though, the Corleone gangs went too far in their war. They claimed too many casualties among the Italian police and the judges, too many innocent people. In Palermo alone, the body count escalated from 101 to 150 in just a year. In the early 80s, Tommaso Buscetta tried to take over the defeated families. He was one of the older godfathers, still alive and in charge. He managed the drug smuggling business between Europe, Asia, and both North and South America.
I
don't know if Buscetta had been appointed to fill in Bontate's role, but I do know he had been asked to return to Palermo and meet with everyone who had remained loyal to Bontate and Badalamenti in order to stir up against the Corleone gangsters.
Buscetta didn't make it. The Corleone gangs forced him to flee for his life. He went to Brazil. In October 1983, Buscetta was arrested in Rio de Janeiro in a joint operation by the Italian police and Interpol. When Italian judge Giovanni Falcone went to Brazil to interrogate him, Buscetta decided Falcone was a man he could trust. He decided to talk. In July 1984, he was extradited to Italy. Judge Falcone wanted an uninterrupted story. He let Buscetta speak freely, even when he described his age-old mafia in romantic terms.
He tries to validate his role as a pure mafioso who follows all principles and does not concede to drug trafficking, and by trying to resort to violence as little as possible. Letting him say what he wants is actually an interrogation technique. Meanwhile, we verify how it all really went, checking things independently when necessary.
In Palermo on the 23rd of May 1992, Toto Riina and his Corleonese men struck at the Italian government by killing Judge Giovanni Falcone, his wife and their bodyguards with a bomb. A few months later, they also killed Judge Paolo Borsellino and his bodyguards. Both judges had been instrumental in gathering the evidence for what was called in Italy the first Maxi trial against the Mafia in the late 80s. In December 1987, at the end of this trial, the court in Palermo found 344 defendants guilty out of 456, sentencing 19 of them to life. The Mafia would take revenge. It lashed out at Italy's artistic heritage. On the 9th of May 1993, even the Pope, on his visit to Sicily, cried his outrage at such mayhem.
Mafia non può cambiare.
The Mafia cannot alter and scorn the holiest right given by God. This people, the Sicilian people, cannot always live under the pressure of an opposing force, a force of death. I say this to those responsible: convert yourselves. God's judgment will come.
Once again, the Mafia had gone too far. One by one, the Corleone gangsters were captured. Toto Riina was arrested in Palermo on the 25th of January 1993. He was tried, found guilty, and sentenced to life.
Many of the American La Cosa Nostra families, they are reluctant to even name one single boss because of the law enforcement efforts that are made against them, particularly by the FBI.
According to both the Italians and the Americans, there are no longer godfathers like there used to be. Once upon a time, Cosa Nostra bosses had to be invisible as mafiosi, but recognizable as godfathers. Now, they can only hide.
Cosa Nostra sta tentando di ricominciare a fare
Cosa Nostra is trying to resume its business without doing anything outrageous, so they can avoid the governments and investigative bodies key to the changes taking place.
In order to survive, Cosa Nostra has to disguise itself in silence. But without the guidance of the great godfathers, the Mafia has failed to regain its age-old invisibility. It has become vulnerable.
We can't afford to relax, because the Mafia takes advantage of those moments, becoming stronger than it was before. Silence and peace are what it wants.
There's talk of a Russian Mafia, a Japanese Mafia, a Colombian Mafia, and many others worldwide. Although they are established criminal organizations, they are not the Mafia as we have come to know it. The real Mafia has gone. All the great godfathers are dead. But many of the traditional Mafia activities are alive and well.